In the winter of 2001, in a postal sorting facility somewhere in the north of England, a machine was being decommissioned. It was the kind of machine that had been running for decades. Metal housings worn smooth at the touch points, rollers turned dull from years of contact with millions of envelopes, internal cavities dark and warm from a long working life. The workers dismantling it were moving through a routine process. They unbolted panels, they disconnected mechanisms, and then, at some point during that process, a hand reached into a cavity in the machine's interior and touched paper. The paper was an envelope. It was addressed to a woman named Janet Barrett in Sheffield. It had been posted in 1953. The letter had been there for 48 years. While the machine processed mail around it, while the facility changed and modernized, while the world outside went through decades of ordinary transformation, that envelope had rested in its dark gap, undisturbed, as stable and settled as something buried in the ground. The handwriting on the front was still legible. The envelope was still sealed. The address was there, clear enough to read, belonging to a woman who, if she were still alive, would by now be substantially older than the person who had sent it. What happened to that letter after its discovery? Whether Janet Barrett was still reachable, whether the letter was delivered, what she made of receiving correspondence posted nearly half a century before, is a question that the available records don't fully answer. What remains is the image of the thing itself, an envelope addressed in a hand that had long since stilled, sitting inside a machine that had been running throughout most of its disappearance, waiting in the dark the way only a very patient or a very lost thing can. The postal system is enormous. It has been enormous for longer than most people think. And within any enormous system that moves material through physical space over time, things go wrong in ways that are quiet and slow rather than dramatic. A letter catches in a mechanism. A sorting error sends a parcel to the wrong depot. A bag is mislaid during a transfer. The failures are, for the most part, invisible. They produce absence rather than damage, and absence is the kind of thing that is hard to find unless something else eventually disturbs it. The history of postal delivery is partly a history of these quiet disturbances, of the moment when something previously lost comes back to light, of the particular kind of surprise that accompanies an object that has been still for a very long time, suddenly arriving in the present. A useful thing to know about the Royal Mail sorting machines that were in operation throughout the mid to late 20th century is that they were mechanical systems with internal geometries that were not always perfectly smooth. Gaps between components, slight misalignments between rollers, cavities and housing structures designed around function rather than perfect interior completeness. These were features of machines built to handle volume at speed, not to leave no corner unaccounted for. A letter that entered such a machine at a slightly wrong angle, or was caught momentarily by a mechanical fault and deflected from its intended path, could find itself in a gap from which the ordinary movement of the machine would not retrieve it. The machine would continue. The letter would not. This is not a remarkable failure. It is the kind of thing that happens inside any sufficiently complex mechanical system that operates for a sufficiently long time. What is less ordinary is the specific arithmetic of the result. 48 years. The letter was posted when the postal workers now decommissioning the machine were not yet born. It was posted when the woman it was addressed to was young enough that her life was still substantially ahead of her. It was there, in that same dark interior, through the coronation of a queen, through the arrival of color television, through the moon landings, through decades of ordinary English winters, through changes in currency and government, and the gradual replacement of everything around it. The gap that held it was probably no larger than a hand's width. It required nothing special. It simply held. There is a particular quality of attention that comes with reading about delayed letters. It is not urgency. It is closer to the feeling of noticing a door in a wall that has been there all along. The world was going on, and this thing was present in it, just not where it could be seen, not where it could do what it was made to do. This envelope addressed to Janet Barrett was not lost in the way a ship is lost at sea. It was present and specific and stationary, doing nothing but holding its own particularity through time. The Dead Letter Office of the United States was formally organized in 1825 under an act of Congress that gave Postmaster General John McLean the authority and the mandate to address the growing problem of undeliverable mail. The problem was real and accumulated. The postal system of the early 19th century operated across a country that was rapidly expanding westward, through territories where addresses were imprecise, where people moved frequently, where handwriting on envelopes could be difficult to decipher, where the delivery infrastructure was still being assembled, town by town and route by route. Letters arrived at post offices with addresses that no longer matched any living resident. Letters arrived with addresses that had never matched any resident at all. Letters arrived damaged, the addresses washed or worn away. They accumulated. The solution was to create a facility where such letters could be handled, opened, examined, cataloged, and either forwarded to their intended recipient if any identifying information remained, or held for a statutory period and then disposed of. The Dead Letter Office occupied a room in Washington, D.C., that by the 1890s, when former clerks began writing published accounts of their time there, had become a place of peculiar inventory. The clerks who worked there moved through their days opening envelopes with practiced efficiency, spreading the contents on wide wooden tables and recording what they found. What they found was not always what anyone would have predicted. The most ordinary contents were ordinary. Letters that had simply lost their way, personal correspondence, business communications, notes that had been overtaken by events. But mixed in with the ordinary were things that suggested the full range of what people trusted to the postal system when they had no other way to move something from one place to another. Currency was common. The post was, before the widespread availability of banking infrastructure, one of the primary ways that money could be transferred over distances. Jewelry appeared regularly, rings sent as tokens of affection or commitment, small pendants, items whose value was personal as much as monetary. Confessions arrived. Hand-drawn maps appeared, showing the locations of property, the arrangements of farms, the routes to places that had no formal address. Each item was cataloged. The clerk's job was to be systematic about what would otherwise be chaos. The statutory holding period for cataloged contents varied over time, but the basic logic was consistent. Hold the contents long enough to allow a late arriving address or a claimant to appear, and then, in the absence of any such resolution, follow the rules about what happened next. For currency, the rules involved the public treasury. For jewelry and other valuables, periodic sales or disposal. For the letters themselves, the paper, the handwriting, the words that had been written by people who believed they were being sent somewhere specific, the end was usually destruction. The clerks who wrote about their time at the Dead Letter Office did not, for the most part, write about this with distress. They wrote about it the way people write about working in a place that handles the overflow of human life at scale, with a kind of interested detachment, and occasionally with the wry observation that the range of what people put in envelopes would surprise anyone who had not spent time with such an inventory. What comes through in those accounts is not melancholy, but something closer to the particular professional equanimity of people who have learned that everything has a procedure, and the procedure, followed carefully, is itself a form of respect for the material. Herman Melville noticed the dead letter office before he wrote about it. His 1853 short story, Bartleby the Scrivener, closes with an image of the dead letter office as a place where communication goes to stop. The narrator, reflecting on the strange, silent, impossible figure of Bartleby, finds himself imagining that Bartleby had once worked sorting dead letters, handling, each day, the accumulated evidence of messages that had never arrived, of words that had traveled toward their destinations and simply failed to reach them. The story uses this as a final note, a quiet image that expands the scale of Bartleby's silence into something wider and more structural. By 1853, the dead letter office had been in operation long enough to have become a cultural idea as well as an institution. Melville's use of it suggests that an educated American reader of that decade would have understood the reference without explanation, would have known without being told what it meant to send something into that particular system. That is a measure of how fully the postal system, including its failures, had entered ordinary life by the middle of the 19th century. People understood how letters moved. They also understood how letters stopped. The V-mail system used by the United States military during the Second World War was an engineering solution to a logistics problem. Sending paper letters across oceans to and from the millions of Americans serving abroad required weight and volume that strained available cargo capacity. The solution was elegant in its basic structure. Soldiers wrote their letters on standardized forms, which were then photographed onto reels of 35mm microfilm. The original paper forms were held and eventually destroyed, or in some cases, held for additional periods before disposal. The microfilm reels traveled by air and sea, their tiny frames carrying the images of thousands of letters in the space that a single bag of paper correspondence would have occupied. At the receiving end, the images were printed out and delivered, smaller than the originals, but readable, bearing the handwriting of the person who had written them. The system worked well for its purpose. By the commonly cited figures, a reel of V-mail film weighed a fraction of an ounce and could carry the equivalent of weight and volume that a substantial sack of paper letters would have required. The military logistics benefit was significant, but the system introduced a new kind of vulnerability. Paper letters individually failed or succeeded on their own terms. A single letter could be lost without affecting the letters posted around it. Microfilm reels, by contrast, carried correspondence in batches. If a reel was damaged by moisture, by mechanical failure, by the ordinary hazards of wartime transport across oceans, the loss was not a single letter, but a batch of them. And in some cases, the solution to a damaged reel was reprinting from surviving partial data or from later photography of held original forms. This could produce, at the delivery end, a situation in which a family received a bundle of letters all on the same afternoon, letters written weeks or months apart, arriving simultaneously, the dates on the envelopes running in a sequence that made no correspondence with the order of arrival. The top envelope dated 3 months before the one at the bottom of the pile, or the reverse, or the letters were out of sequence in some less predictable way. The practical experience of receiving V-mail was, for many families, the experience of reading correspondence in an order that the sender had not intended, assembling a picture of a person's life abroad from fragments that arrived in ways that the postal timeline had scrambled. This was not loss. It was something more like dislocation, a small displacement in the orderly relationship between when something was written and when it was read that produced, at the receiving end, a particular quality of attention. The family reading V-mail letters in November of 1944 was reading letters written in July, in August, in September, in October, all on the same afternoon, reconstructing a sequence that had been broken in transit and was now being reassembled on a kitchen table in Ohio or Georgia or Massachusetts. The letters were there. The words were there. The sequence just needed to be found. In the early years of the 21st century, construction workers undertaking a renovation project in Missoula, Montana, paused their work when letters began to come out of a wall. The building they were working on was old enough that its walls contained the history of previous construction and reconstruction, layers of plaster and timber that had been added or modified over the decades. When a section of wall was opened, the workers found a cache of letters, still in their envelopes, slightly discolored at the edges, but otherwise intact. The letters had been sealed inside the wall since the 1940s. The Missoula winters and summers, the cold that moves down from the Rockies and settles across the valley floor, the warm seasons that follow, had passed over that building for 50 or 60 years, while the letters rested inside it. How letters come to be inside walls is a question that has a range of answers depending on the specific case. Sometimes material falls through gaps during construction and is sealed in accidentally. Sometimes items are placed deliberately, in the old tradition of embedding objects within structures as markers or tokens, a practice that has been documented in buildings across centuries. In the case of the Missoula letters, the exact mechanism by which they had come to rest in the wall is not fully established. What is established is that they were there, and that their discovery prompted an effort to identify the senders and recipients. At least one of the Missoula letters was ultimately delivered. The recipient was the elderly daughter of the soldier who had written it, a woman who received, in the early years of the 21st century, a letter from her father written in the decade of her childhood, when the world was at war and her father was writing from somewhere that required his correspondence to be addressed and posted through a military system. The letter had traveled a very particular route from her father's hand into the postal stream, into a building in Missoula, into a wall cavity, through 6 decades of quiet, and then back out again into a world that had changed enormously around it while it waited. What the recipient made of that arrival, what it meant to hold something written by her father when she was young, delivered when she was old, is a question that the structural register of this part of the story does not need to answer. The bare shape of the thing is sufficient to carry its own weight. The letter was written. The letter was lost. The letter was found. The letter arrived. The Easter Rising of April 1916 in Dublin lasted 6 days. When it ended, the British military authorities were in possession of a great deal of material that the Rising's leaders had written, carried, and exchanged. The correspondence and documents connected to the Rising's leaders, including letters they had written in the days and hours before their execution in May of 1916, entered a system of military censorship and archival control that would restrict public access to some of this material for decades. The specific letters that the executed leaders had composed for their families, and the family correspondence connected to the circumstances of their deaths, moved at different speeds through the processes of classification, restriction, and eventual release. Some of this material was not publicly accessible until around the centenary year of 2016, 100 years after the events it recorded. The letters that Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, and others had written in the last hours before their execution had their own complicated histories of holding and release, of archival custody and controlled access, of documents that were known to exist but not available to be read. What this produced for historians and for family descendants was a form of delayed arrival that operated not through mechanical failure or accidental concealment, but through institutional process, the formal, deliberate structure of an archive that held material according to rules about when it could be released. The result at the receiving end of that long institutional delay was correspondence arriving into a different world than the one that had sent it. A letter written in the last hours before an execution, read for the first time by people born 40 or 60 or 80 years after it was composed, is not doing the same work it would have done if delivered promptly. It is arriving into a context shaped by everything that happened after the moment of its writing. The words are the same, the world around them is not. This is a feature of all delayed correspondence, but the Easter Rising letters make it particularly vivid because the stakes of the original moment were so high and the institutional mechanisms of delay were so deliberate. The archive knew what it held. It held it for reasons. The letters waited in a condition of managed absence, not lost, not delivered, but occupying the specific middle state of a document that existed and was inaccessible at the same time. Pan American Airways began its transoceanic airmail operations in the late 1930s with a class of aircraft called Clipper flying boats, large, four-engine planes capable of crossing oceans by stopping at island and coastal refueling stations spread across both the Pacific and the Atlantic. The Clipper routes connected the United States to the Philippines, to Hong Kong, to England, to destinations in South America. They moved mail across distances that had previously required weeks by sea in a matter of days by air. Within a decade of the inauguration of those routes, the Second World War had changed the context of transoceanic correspondence entirely. The Clipper routes themselves were transformed by wartime requirements. The infrastructure that Pan Am had built for commercial airmail became part of the enormous logistics apparatus of a global conflict, and the correspondence that moved through it was shaped by censorship, by delay, by the vast movements of military personnel across the map of the world. Letters written in the Pacific Theater had to find their way home through a system under extraordinary strain. Letters written at home had to find their way to men and women stationed in places that had barely appeared on commercial maps before the war began. The censor's stamp is a specific physical mark. On a wartime letter, it appears as a rectangular or oval impression in purple or red ink, sometimes accompanied by tape that reseals a flap that has been opened for inspection. A letter bearing a censor stamp has been read by someone other than its intended recipient. Its words have passed through an institutional filter designed to prevent information useful to an enemy from moving through the postal stream. The censor read it, satisfied themselves about its contents, resealed it, stamped it with the evidence of their reading, and sent it on. Some of those stamped envelopes did not reach their destinations. They entered military archive systems in the countries that had opened and held them, in folders organized by date and unit and classification, sitting in facilities that would themselves move and change and eventually become the repositories consulted by historians looking for primary sources. A sealed envelope bearing a purple censor stamp, its flap resealed with official tape, sitting in a military archive folder in Dublin for decades before anyone looks at it again. This is a very particular kind of delayed delivery. The letter was not lost in the way the Sheffield letter was lost, caught in a machine's dark interior. It was held by a system that had its own logic of retention. It was present in the archive. Someone, in some formal sense, knew it was there. But between knowing a thing exists and delivering it to the person it was written for, There is a distance that can be crossed quickly or slowly, or in some cases, not at all, before circumstances have changed entirely. When the construction workers in Missoula found the letters in the wall, they stopped working. That pause is worth sitting with for a moment. The particular quality of a physical work, stopping because something unexpected and quiet has appeared in the course of the task. Construction work involves the opening of old structures, the exposure of what has been enclosed. This exposure usually reveals insulation, previous construction materials, pipes running between floors, the ordinary accumulated infrastructure of a building's life. Finding letters is different. Letters are made to be read. They are addressed to specific people. They carry handwriting. Their presence inside a wall is a kind of violation of the basic logic of what letters are for, and the workers encountering them would have understood that immediately, without needing to articulate it. The envelopes came out of the gap between the plaster and the timber, slightly discolored, the addresses still legible on their fronts. They came out into a Montana afternoon that was nothing like the afternoon in which they had been placed inside the wall. The building around them had aged. The town around the building had changed. The people whose names were written on the envelopes were either very old or gone entirely. The letters had been still for all of it. The image of the letters as they were found, before any attempt was made to trace their recipients, before the question of delivery arose, simply as objects discovered, is one of the cleaner instances of what happens when a physical record outlasts the circumstances it was created in. The letters in the wall were not meant to be there. They were not preserved as archives. They were not sealed away in the expectation that they would one day be opened and found to be historically significant. They were simply there, in the accidental way that things can be somewhere for a very long time without anyone arranging for it. The clerks of the dead letter office in Washington, D.C., working through their days in the 1890s under gaslight at wide wooden tables, were in the business of systematically confronting this kind of material. Every envelope they opened had been written to someone. Every piece of currency that came out of an envelope had been sent toward a specific hand. Every hand-drawn map had been composed by a specific person who needed someone else to be able to find a specific place. The clerk's job was to treat all of it with equal patient attention. The note that had simply lost its address, the letter containing a sum of money intended to cover a debt, the confession addressed to someone whose name matched no current resident at the address given. The ledgers in which the clerks recorded their discoveries were themselves a kind of secondary correspondence, a record of what had been sent and had not arrived, a catalog of the postal system's accumulated losses, organized and preserved by the very institution that had failed to deliver them. The inventory grew as the country grew. The range of what appeared on those tables reflected the range of what people trusted to the mail. People sent important things by post because the post was the most reliable system available, and reliability is always relative. Reliable enough most of the time, which means not reliable enough sometimes, and the evidence of the sometimes accumulated in Washington, D.C., in wooden drawers and cataloged ledgers, patient and organized. The dead letter clerks were not, in most cases, the final stop. The statutory period gave the contents a window in which they could still find their way to where they were going. An address could turn up. A name that had seemed unlocatable could be matched by patient cross-referencing against other records to an actual person in an actual town. The holding period was built on the recognition that absence is not always permanent, that the information needed to complete a delivery sometimes arrived after the delivery had failed. The system had a built-in tolerance for delay. It was structured around the understanding that the gap between sending and receiving was not always predictable. This is, when examined closely, a fairly unusual feature for a bureaucratic system to have internalized so explicitly. Most institutional processes are built around the expectation of events proceeding in the anticipated order. The dead letter office was built around the expectation that they sometimes wouldn't. Its entire function was to be the repository for the cases where the order had broken down, the place where the broken thing was held carefully until it could be repaired, or, failing that, documented and released. The letters that were ultimately destroyed after the holding period had elapsed, after no address had come to light, after the legal requirements for disposal had been met, were, in a certain sense, the letters that lost both times. They failed to be delivered originally, and they failed to be recovered. The dead letter office's ledger is the record of both failures. The entry in the ledger is all that remains of what someone wrote, sealed and trusted to the postal stream, with the expectation that it would arrive. The microfilm reels of V-mail carried images that were not the original letters. They were photographs of letters, reproductions that had been made precisely because the originals were too heavy and bulky to move efficiently across oceans in wartime. The man or woman who received a printed V-mail letter was receiving something that was at one remove from the original. The content was present, the handwriting was reproduced, but the paper itself was not the paper that had been under the writer's hand. The original form had been held and eventually destroyed or otherwise disposed of. The real had traveled in its place. This distinction between the original object and its reproduction is part of the specific texture of V-mail as a form of correspondence. The letters arrived. They were read. The communication they contained was received. But the physical object that the writer had touched, the paper that had been under the pen, was gone. Only the image remained. This is a feature of V-mail that is easy to pass over when thinking about it as a communication system, and becomes more significant when thinking about it as an object. Letters, among other things, are physical objects. The specific quality of their survival as physical objects is part of what they carry over time. The Missoula letters that came out of the wall were physical objects. They were not reproductions. They were not photographs of something else. They were the actual envelopes, the actual paper, the actual ink of whatever hand had addressed them and whatever hand had written the words inside. Their survival inside the wall was the survival of the original, not the survival of a copy. This is part of what made their discovery significant enough that the workers stopped and looked and eventually set in motion the process of trying to find out who they had been written to. The sorting machine in Sheffield that held the letter addressed to Janet Barrett held an original. The envelope that came out of that machine's interior in 2001 had been there since 1953. Not a copy, not a microfilmed image. The envelope that a hand had addressed, that had entered the postal stream, that had been deflected by some small mechanical fault into a gap from which it did not emerge for 48 years. That specific object, with the specific writing on it, still addressed in the original hand to Janet Barrett in Sheffield. That specificity, the fact that the handwriting on the envelope was the handwriting that had been placed there in 1953 by whoever wrote it, is not a trivial detail. It is part of what makes a delayed letter a different kind of object than a delayed message. The message might be reproduced. The handwriting is particular to a person and a moment. It was made once by a specific hand, under specific circumstances, and it exists only in that one form. The envelope that sat inside the sorting machine for 48 years carried something that could not be replaced by a later copy or a later description. It carried the original mark. The workers in Missoula who opened the wall and found the letters were holding envelopes that had been sealed since the 1940s. The writing on the fronts was the writing of people who had composed it at a specific desk on a specific day in the middle of a decade that the workers handling the envelopes had never lived through. Montana in the 1940s, the particular cold of those winters, the quality of light in those summers, the specific circumstances of households managing wartime correspondence, was present in those envelopes only as the record the writers had left in their handwriting, their word choices, the particular ink they had used. The wall had held all of it. Decades of Montana winters and summers had passed over the building, and inside it, between the plaster and the timber, the letters had rested in their particular darkness, not preserved in any formal sense, not in a controlled archival environment, not in acid-free folders, not attended to by any institutional care. Simply held. The wall did not know it was holding them. The building did not recognize their significance. The letters were there in the same way that anything small and flat can be somewhere for a long time if nothing comes to disturb it. They were there through the Korean War and the years following it, through the Cold War's long uncertainty, through the arrivals of television, of interstate highways, of decades of change in the valley around them, through the changes in the building itself, its renovations and repaints, and the ordinary cycles of use and wear. The letters did not participate in any of it. They were held by the wall, in the dark through all the years of it, and when the workers opened that section of wall, the letters were still there, still addressed, still sealed, still carrying whatever words had been placed inside them by the soldiers who had written them in the 1940s, when everything that came later had not yet happened and the envelopes were new. A sheet of onion skin paper held between two fingers weighs almost nothing at all. The paper is so thin that the light comes through it, not strongly, but enough that the shadow of your hand shows faintly on the other side, and the lines of ink on the reverse face bleed through as pale ghosts of letters, reversed, almost readable. When a fountain pen moves across a surface like this, the nib finds a kind of soft resistance that thicker paper does not offer. The sheet gives very slightly under the pressure. It shifts. On a still day, it holds its position well enough, but near an open window, it lifts at one corner with every small movement of the air, and a writer working at a desk beside such a window learns to hold the page lightly with one hand while writing with the other, the paper tilting and settling, the words accumulating in a neat line across a surface that seems barely there at all. This was the paper that carried correspondence across oceans for most of the early 20th century. Onion skin, named for the vegetable's outermost dry layer, which it genuinely resembles in translucency and in the way it feels between the fingers, was chosen for long-distance letter writing, not because of any particular elegance, though it had a kind of spare elegance of its own, but because of its weight. A ream of it, 500 sheets, weighed between 9 and 11 pounds. Standard writing paper of the same period ran considerably heavier. The difference mattered enormously when letters were priced by weight, when a sheet that was lighter by even a fraction of an ounce could reduce the cost of sending a letter across an ocean enough to make the difference between sending it and not sending it at all. For families separated by distance, emigrants who had gone ahead and were writing back to those still waiting, soldiers writing home from places their families could not find on a map, correspondents in different countries who had never found a reason to stop writing to one another. This thin paper was the practical medium of connection, A letter written on it could travel far without becoming expensive. It could hold a great deal if the writer wrote small and used both sides, the text on the reverse showing through the sheet as a soft, illegible shadow that did not, if the handwriting was well formed, interfere too much with the reading of the front. A skilled correspondent learned to account for this. A skilled reader learned to read through it. The fountain pen that wrote on that paper was an instrument with its own particular chemistry. Iron gall ink, which had been the dominant writing fluid in Europe and its territories for centuries before the period under discussion, was made from a small number of ingredients that were in the early 20th century still widely available and still widely used. Iron sulfate was one, tannin extracted from oak galls, the round woody growths that appear on oak trees when certain wasps lay their eggs inside the bark, was another. These two primary components were combined with gum arabic, which gave the ink its body and its slight viscosity, and with water, and the result was a fluid that could be drawn up into the reservoir of a pen and set to work. The line this ink produced appeared, when first applied to paper, considerably lighter than it would later become. A sentence written in iron gall ink on a white sheet of onion skin looked pale when fresh, a warm tan or light brown, not the deep dark line one might expect. The darkening happened with time, as the iron in the mixture oxidized on contact with the air, the chemical process deepening the color of the dried ink over the hours and days following application. A letter written in the morning might look appreciably darker by the time it was folded and sealed that afternoon. One that had been in an envelope for a week, by the time it was opened and read, would show ink that was fully dark, deep brown shading toward black, the line confident and settled, the words looking as permanent as print. This quality of deepening meant that old letters, properly stored, often looked more legible than newly written ones. A letter that had been in a dry archive for 50 years might have ink so darkened it appeared to have been written with a bold hand, even if the original writer had used a fine nib. The words sat on the page with weight. They did not seem to be going anywhere. The pens that carried this ink came in a considerable variety of styles and sizes, but the dominant designs of the early to mid-20th century were associated with a small number of manufacturers whose names became, in certain circles, by words for quality. A Parker pen had a particular nib geometry. A Waterman had a different one. The flex of the nib, the degree to which its two tines could be pressed slightly apart under writing pressure, producing a line that thickened where the hand pushed harder and narrowed where it lifted, varied between models, between nibs, and between individual examples of the same design, so that two pens nominally identical might write quite differently. A nib broken in by a particular hand over a particular period of years became in a sense calibrated to that hand. It knew the pressure points, it knew where the strokes would be quick and where they would slow. A person accustomed to writing with a good pen on onion skin paper worked in a particular way. The nib required very little pressure. Too much and it would catch, drag, tear the thin surface. The hand that had learned the paper learned to write lightly. The letters formed under a touch so slight that a person watching might not have seen the hand moving at all, might have seen only the line of ink appearing behind the nib. Word by word, the pen moving steadily left to right across a page that the other hand kept anchored against the air. The envelope that received this letter was itself a standardized object by the mid-20th century, though it had not always been. For a long period, letters were simply folded so that the outside of the fold became an address surface, the letter sealing itself against reading by the configuration of the folds and by a wax seal applied at the point where the paper overlapped. Sealing wax was a small production, A stick of it, held above a candle flame, began to soften after a few seconds, the wax becoming malleable, a slow bead forming and detaching to fall in an amber drop onto the back of the letter where the flap overlapped. The wax spread slightly on contact with the paper, cooling quickly, its surface just solid enough to receive the impression of a seal before it set entirely. A signet ring pressed into it at the right moment left an image in the wax, a letter, a crest, a device of some kind that functioned both as decoration and as evidence. If the seal was broken when the letter arrived, the recipient knew someone else had opened it. Gum Arabic adhesive on envelope flaps began replacing wax seals gradually through the 19th century, the shift accelerating in the United Kingdom following the wide adoption of the penny black stamp in 1840. The penny black, which standardized the price of domestic letter postage to a single penny, regardless of distance, a considerable simplification from the previous system in which postage varied by distance and was typically paid by the recipient, made sending letters sufficiently routine and high volume that the self-sealing wax ritual became less practical. An envelope that could be sealed by wetting a strip of adhesive and pressing it closed was faster. It worked for the volumes the new postal age required. The wax seal did not disappear entirely. It persisted in formal correspondence, in certain official contexts, in the preferences of writers who valued the ritual, but for ordinary letter writing, the gummed envelope became the default and remained so. Pressed shut and held for a moment, the gummed flap of an envelope created a bond that was meant to be permanent. In practice, in damp conditions, the adhesive sometimes failed. Letters arrived at their destinations with flaps that had come loose in transit, the envelope half open, the letter inside visible. In very dry conditions, the opposite sometimes occurred. The adhesive drew so tight that opening the envelope without tearing it required patience and a careful hand. Most letters were opened with a single clean motion, a finger inserted under the corner of the flap and drawn along the top, the envelope yielding along the glued line, the letter inside revealed. What happened to an envelope once it was sealed and addressed depended on where in the world it was posted, but the immediate step was usually the same. The letter went into a collection point, a box on a street corner, a counter at a post office, the hands of a rural letter carrier who collected as well as delivered, and from there it entered a sorting process. In a post office or sorting facility of the mid-20th century, letters arrived in volume and moved through the hands of clerks who knew the routes and the destinations, sorting by region and then by locality, the process of narrowing a letter toward its specific address happening in stages across a working day. One of the instruments used in this process was the hand cancellation stamp, a rubber-faced device mounted on a handle and loaded with ink. It could be brought down onto an envelope in a single motion, leaving an impression that served several purposes at once. It obliterated the postage stamp, marking it as used and preventing its removal and reuse. It printed the name of the originating post office. It recorded the date. In a great many cases, it also recorded the time of day, morning, afternoon, or evening, in which the letter had been received for processing, so that the envelope carried on its face a precise record of when and where it had entered the postal stream. These marks were not decorative, but they were not without a kind of documentary beauty. The inked circle, the town name in capital letters curving around the arc, the date at the center, the day, month, and year compressed into a neat format, and the time all pressed into the paper in a single practice stroke by a clerk who had made the same motion hundreds of times that morning. A clerk working a cancellation shift in a rural post office in the early 1950s would have applied that stamp to a stack of letters in a sustained rhythm, each envelope lifted, positioned, struck, and set aside in a motion that became, over the course of a shift, nearly automatic. The letters passed through without the clerk reading them, without any particular awareness of their contents, their distance, their urgency, or the lack of it. They were envelopes with addresses. The address determined where they went. The cancellation mark recorded when they left. From the originating post office, a letter bound for a destination overseas traveled by whatever route was available, and the routes available in the early and mid-20th century changed considerably across the period. In the early decades of airmail, the routes were shorter, more domestic, and dependent on a postal system that was still largely land-based and sea-based for international delivery. Letters took weeks to cross oceans. They traveled in the holds of ships, in the company of cargo, rising and falling on the water's own schedule, arriving when the ship arrived. The flying boats changed this. Pan American Airways, developing its transoceanic routes through the mid to late 1930s, operated a class of aircraft that had no land-based equivalent for range and payload. The Martin the 1000th, 130, and the Boeing 314, both referred to under the Pan American name as Clipper aircraft, were enormous machines by the standards of their era, capable of operating from water rather than prepared runways, which meant they could land at island refueling points across stretches of ocean that had no airfields at all. The Pacific route from San Francisco to Manila, which opened for passenger and airmail service in 1936, crossed the ocean in stages to Honolulu, to Midway, to Wake Island, to Guam, and then to Manila, with fuel and provisions taken on at each stop. The journey that once required weeks by ship could now be completed in days. A flying boat sitting in the water of San Francisco Bay at dawn was a particular kind of sight. The hull sat low, the aircraft's weight carried on the water as a ship's hull would carry it. The broad wings extended over the surface, the four engines silent before the first start of the day. Mail bags loaded aboard the previous evening rested in the cargo hold below the passenger deck. Letters in those bags had been written days or weeks before, collected, sorted, canceled, bundled, and driven to the waterfront, and now they waited in the dark of the hold as the ground crew moved around the aircraft in the early morning, checking, preparing, making the final assessments before departure. When the engines started, the sound crossed the bay. The propellers turned. The flying boat moved out from its mooring, picked up speed across the water, the hull throwing long white lines of spray on either side as the aircraft accelerated, the nose lifting first, and then the whole machine rising, the water releasing it, the surface dropping away below as the Clipper gained altitude and turned west, the bay still visible in the pre-dawn light as a flat gray surface beneath the wings, growing smaller, the city at its eastern edge diminishing into shape and then into line and then into the general mass of the land. Inside the cargo hold, the mail bags were still, the letters in them were still. They were traveling now at a speed and altitude that their writers had not imagined when they wrote them, crossing water at a pace that made the earlier era of sea mail seem almost geological by comparison. A letter written on a Tuesday in San Francisco might be read on a Saturday in Manila. This was not ordinary speed for correspondence. It was remarkable speed, and people who used the service understood it as remarkable and wrote accordingly, briefly, sometimes, because the letter would arrive quickly, and an answer could be expected quickly. And the long discursive letters suited to a wait of weeks seemed less necessary when the wait was counted in days. The microfilm process used for wartime V-mail operated on related logic, pushed further. A V-mail letter was written on a standardized form, a single sheet with space for an address and a message, the format fixed so that the letter could be photographed efficiently. The soldier or civilian who wrote one filled in the available space, folded the form, and handed it over for processing. At a central facility, a technician photographed the letter onto a reel of microfilm. Hundreds of letters fit on a single reel. The reel, a fraction of the weight of the original letters, was loaded onto an aircraft and flown to a processing facility near the destination. There, the images on the reel were printed onto small paper sheets, reduced from the original size, and the prints were delivered in place of the original letters. The reel of microfilm crossing an ocean contained a great deal of correspondence in a small package. Where a bag of conventional letters might weigh many pounds, the equivalent number of V-mail images on a reel might weigh ounces. The logistics of moving correspondence in wartime, when aircraft space was scarce and weight was always a constraint, made this compression practically valuable. The letters arrived smaller than they had been written, the handwriting reduced to a size that required some readers to hold the paper at arm's length or closer than normal, the image slightly different from a standard letter in ways that were immediately noticeable, but that most recipients accommodated without much difficulty. A reel of microfilm that had been damaged by moisture, by improper handling, by the ordinary hazards of transit in difficult conditions, could render an entire batch of correspondence undeliverable in its filmed form. In such cases, depending on the protocols in place and whether the original forms had been retained, a batch of letters might be reprinted from recovered portions of the reel, or new prints made from surviving frames, and dispatched together. A family receiving correspondence this way might find themselves opening letter after letter on a single afternoon, each one dated weeks or months before the others, the arrival sequence bearing no relation to the composition sequence. The most recent letter perhaps buried somewhere in the middle of a stack where it had been placed by chance. There was something particular about reading a stack of letters out of order. The mind worked to reconstruct the sequence, tracking the dates on each letter, noting the events referred to, arranging the narrative into a coherent line. This was not difficult. Dates were written clearly. Events referred to one another in ways that made sequence apparent, but it was different from reading letters in the order they arrived, where the sequence imposed itself without effort. Reading out of order required a small sustained act of reconstruction. Onion skin paper, iron gall ink, the gummed envelope, the cancellation stamp, the flying boat, the microfilm reel, these were not separate technologies, but components of a system that had developed over a long period. Each element responding to practical problems, the others created or made visible. Paper too heavy to fly affordably became paper light enough to ghost through with light. Ink that started pale settled into permanence over hours. Seals that once required candle and wax gave way to adhesive that required only moisture and pressure. Stamps that once had to be paid by the recipient were made cheap enough to be paid at the point of sending. Routes that once required weeks became routes that required days. The clerks who moved letters through this system knew it from the inside. A postal worker sorting mail in a regional facility in the early 1950s handled letters that had originated in dozens of different countries, written in a range of languages, addressed in hands that varied from the formal copperplate of careful correspondence to the rapid scrawl of people writing quickly and trusting the address to be legible enough. The clerk read addresses and sorted by them. The content of the letters was irrelevant to the work. The sender's name, the return address, the destination, these were what mattered at the sorting stage. Everything else was sealed inside. A letter moving through the system was private in a way that felt complete. The envelope closed the letter against the world. The seal held it. The address directed it. The postal worker who handled it was engaged with the outside of the object, not the inside. From the moment of sealing to the moment of opening, the letter existed in a kind of intermediate state, sent but not received, dispatched but not read, traveling between two people without quite belonging to either. The physical experience of receiving a letter was its own small event. An envelope dropped through a door slot or placed in a mailbox arrived in a specific way, the address side visible, the return address, if there was one, offering a first clue about the sender before the envelope was turned over and opened. The feel of the letter through the envelope gave some information, how many sheets were inside, whether anything else had been enclosed, whether the paper was ordinary correspondence stock or something thinner and more translucent. A letter written on onion skin, enclosed in its envelope, felt light enough to be almost surprising. There was something there, but barely. The hand expected more weight than it found. Opening the letter revealed the paper in stages. A single folded sheet opened into a rectangle, twice its folded size. Two sheets folded together opened more substantially. The onion skin paper, unfolded, lay lightly in the hands, not limp, but not stiff either, finding a gentle plane, the ink already fully darkened on the lines of text. The handwriting was whatever it was, the particular shape of the letters, the specific angle of the uprights, the way the writer formed their lowercase letters, the pressure they applied, the speed the slant suggested. These were individual qualities. They belonged to a specific person's hand and to no other. Reading the letter was not only reading the words, but reading all of this at once, the content and the manner of its inscription arriving together. The letter, when it had been read, could be folded again. It could be kept. Onion skin paper stored carefully in a cool, dry place remained legible for decades. The iron gall ink did not fade in the way some writing fluids faded. It oxidized fully and then held its dark color, the words staying readable through years and decades without appreciable loss. A letter written in the 1940s and stored in a box or a drawer remained 50 years later as legible as it had been when new, sometimes more so, the ink having reached its full depth of color, the pale lines of the original writing long since darkened into something firm and clear. This durability was not designed. It was a consequence of the materials being used for their practical purposes, the chemistry of the ink, and the structure of the paper combining in ways that happened to produce longevity as a side effect of function. The writers who used this paper and this ink were not archivists. They were people who needed to communicate across distance and chose the lightest available means of doing so. What they produced in the course of that practical necessity were objects that lasted. The letters that traveled on Pan-American clipper routes were posted at prices that reflected the speed being offered. Airmail rates were higher than surface mail rates. The cost of the infrastructure, the aircraft, the fuel, the island facilities, all absorbed into the price of a stamp or surcharge affixed to the letter. A person sending a letter by clipper across the Pacific was paying for speed and paying considerably. A person sending the same letter by ship was paying less and waiting longer. These were choices, and they were made by people who had calculated what the communication was worth to them in terms of time and money, and had acted accordingly. On the morning a clipper departed from San Francisco on a Pacific route, the aircraft carried in its hold the correspondence of people who had made that calculation. Some of the letters were urgent, business matters, medical news, arrangements that required timely responses. Some were not urgent in any practical sense, but had been sent by airmail anyway, because the writer wanted the letter to arrive soon, because they wanted the reduced interval between sending and receiving, because they could afford it and valued the connection it represented. The letters did not know, inside the mail bag, which category they occupied. They traveled together in the dark of the cargo hold, the aircraft moving above the water of the Pacific at an altitude and speed that the letter's writers, sitting at their desks with their thin paper and their good pens, would have found extraordinary. The route across the Pacific took the flying boat over water for most of its length. The intermediate stops, Honolulu, Midway, Wake, Guam, were brief interruptions in a journey that was otherwise ocean and sky. From the air, on a clear day, the water below showed its depth and color, deep blue far from land, shifting to lighter shades over shallows near islands, the surface unbroken for hours in any direction except by the thin white line of the aircraft's own shadow, moving across it when the light was right. The cargo in the hold moved with the aircraft. The letters moved with the cargo. The words inside the envelopes were, for the duration of the flight, in transit between two states, sent and received, past and present, carried westward at speed above the widest ocean on the planet. At the far end of the route, the aircraft landed on water again, the hull meeting the surface in a long decelerating run, the spray rising on either side, the speed coming off the machine gradually as the hull settled into its seaborne configuration. The engines throttling back. The mail bags were unloaded. The letters were sorted again, by address, by locality, moving through a postal system at the far end of the route that operated on the same basic principles as the one at the near end: clerks, sorting tables, cancellation stamps, the same practiced motion of envelopes handled by the hundred through a working day. A letter that had been written on a Tuesday morning at a desk in San Francisco on a sheet of onion skin so light it lifted in the draft from the window, with a pen whose iron gall ink had started pale and was already darkening as the envelope was sealed, that had been canceled with a stamp recording the date and time and originating office, that had traveled by surface to the waterfront and been loaded onto a flying boat departing at dawn, that had crossed the ocean in stages with fuel stops on small Pacific islands, could arrive in Manila in under a week. It had traveled through the hands of perhaps a dozen postal workers. It had crossed the widest ocean in the world. It sat at the far end of that journey, inside an envelope that showed no signs of its crossing, slightly worn at the corners, perhaps. The cancellation mark dried into the paper in its precise record of departure, but otherwise intact, the seal still holding, the letter inside exactly as it had been placed when the flap was licked and pressed and held. The person who received it felt the lightness of the onion skin through the envelope before they opened it. They recognized the handwriting on the address, or they did not, and looked instead at the return address to understand who had sent it. They opened it with the practiced motion of someone who received letters, the finger under the flap, the single smooth motion, and the letter unfolded in their hands, the pages opening out, the ink dark and clear, the words arriving, word by word as the paper opened, the voice of the writer present in every line. The ink had deepened since it was applied. The words that had first appeared pale on the thin paper were fully dark now. The lines of text settled into the surface of the onion skin with a permanence that made them seem like they had always been there. The paper, folded for the duration of the journey, unfolded without tearing, without protest, the thin sheet finding its flat shape again in the hands of the reader, the text on the reverse just visible through the translucent surface, a faint ghost of words in reverse, the letter giving access to itself on one side while keeping the other in a kind of soft illegibility. The Pan American clipper that had carried it was, at that moment, somewhere else entirely, returned to San Francisco, waiting for another departure, carrying another set of mailbags on another route. The flying boats operated continuously, moving correspondence between continents across the oceans, the specific journey any one letter had taken becoming, once complete, indistinguishable from all the other journeys the aircraft made. The letter had arrived. The aircraft moved on. The system continued without marking any of its individual passages as particular or significant. What remained was the letter, the thin page in the reader's hands, the dark ink, the specific handwriting of a specific person, the gummed envelope, now open at the top, set aside, the cancellation mark on the face of the envelope recording the departure point and date. Legible still in the ink, the clerk had pressed into it in a single practiced motion on a morning weeks before, half a world away. The letter had traveled through all of that to arrive in these specific hands on this specific afternoon, and it lay in those hands now as lightly as the paper itself, nearly weightless, carrying everything it had been sent to carry, the words sitting dark and clear and still on a surface so thin that the afternoon light came gently through it. A letter arrives unfolded in the hands, not opened yet exactly, just unfolded, the paper giving its small sound of resistance at the crease, that soft, dry whisper of a sheet that has been pressed flat for a long time, finding its way back toward open. The handwriting appears word by word as the page spreads, a name at the top, then a date, then a line of words and a hand the reader knows so well that the signature at the bottom is almost redundant, the identity of the writer already certain before the eye reaches it. This is the particular quality of receiving a handwritten letter from someone whose writing the hand recognizes. The message and the messenger arrive together. The words on the page are not a record of a voice. They are something closer to a presence, the pressure of a specific hand on a specific nib, the slight angle of an individual wrist, the loops and connections that no two people form in quite the same way. When that writing belongs to someone who is no longer living or someone who has not been in contact for decades, the letter does something particular to the person holding it. Researchers who study cases of delayed correspondence, letters that arrived years or decades after they were sent, have noticed that recipients rarely describe the experience simply as receiving news. What they tend to describe is something closer to an encounter. Psychologists and grief researchers examining documented cases of delayed correspondence have found a phrase that comes up with notable consistency across accounts from different decades and different countries. Recipients describe what several researchers have characterized as temporal vertigo. The phrase is not a clinical term in the formal diagnostic sense, but it captures something real about what the mind does when it is asked to hold two moments in the same hand. The letter was written in one time. It is being read in another. The handwriting on the page belongs to a past that has already resolved. The writer has aged, or moved, or died, or the relationship has long since settled into whatever form it eventually took, and yet the words are arriving now, addressed to a person the writer knew in that earlier moment, speaking into a present that the letter's author could not have imagined. The mind understands all of this at once, and the understanding is not distressing, exactly, but it is not comfortable either. It occupies a register for which ordinary life does not provide a great deal of practice. Researchers working in grief and bereavement have spent considerable time in recent decades trying to understand what objects do that words about objects cannot. Colin Murray Parks, a British psychiatrist whose work on bereavement became foundational in the field across the second half of the 20th century, was among the first to document systematically the way physical objects associated with deceased individuals could trigger what he described as grief, reactivation, a return of emotional states that had been held at a manageable distance, brought suddenly close again through sensory encounter. Parks and later researchers found that this reactivation tended to occur not through conscious memory or deliberate recollection, but through the limbic system's older, faster processing of sensory information. A smell, a texture under the fingers, a visual pattern so deeply familiar that recognition precedes thought. The brain knows what it is seeing before the conscious mind has finished reading the first line. A handwritten letter, in this framework, is a particularly dense object. It carries the visual signature of a specific person's movement, not just the words they chose, but the way the pen moved while they chose them, the pressure that lightened at the top of each letter and increased at the downstroke, the small habitual abbreviations, the particular way a capital letter was formed. When researchers in archival and museum settings began studying the experience of people who handled original handwritten letters, as opposed to transcriptions or printed reproductions, what they found was a consistent and statistically significant difference in reported engagement. Visitors who lifted an original letter from its protective folder and held it, even through the barrier of cotton reading gloves, consistently described a stronger felt sense of connection to the period in which it was written. The same words on a printed page or on a screen produced measurably less of this response. Something in the materiality of the original object, in its specific texture and slight weight, and the microscopic traces of the hand that had moved across it, registered in the reader in ways that reproduction could not fully transmit. This is not entirely surprising when it is examined carefully. A handwritten letter retains physical evidence of its own making in a way that most objects do not. The nib of a fountain pen, moving across paper under the pressure of a human hand, leaves impressions in the surface of the sheet that can sometimes be felt as faint ridges when a finger moves across the page in a good raking light. The ink in the grooves of the letter forms is slightly thicker than the ink at the edges where the nib lifted. When researchers in archival reading rooms describe the experience of handling a letter written a century ago, they sometimes mention noticing these slight indentations, these traces of pressure, the physical record, not just of what was written, but of the exact motion of the hand that wrote it. That motion was made by a person. The person is gone. The indentation is still there. In the archive, in the quiet of the reading room, the gap between those two facts can feel very small. Pauline Boss, a family therapist and researcher who worked for many years at the University of Minnesota, introduced a concept in the late 1970s that has found its way into bereavement research, into social work practice, and into the accounts that people give of their own experience of loss. She called it ambiguous loss. The idea emerged from her work with families of soldiers listed as missing in action following the Vietnam War, people who were living with a loss that had no clear endpoint, no body, no confirmed date of death, no ritual through which the fact of the absence could be formally acknowledged and the grief formally begun. Boss found that the families of the missing existed in a particular kind of suspended state, neither fully grieving nor fully not grieving, unable to move through the ordinary stages that bereavement research had mapped out, because the central fact, whether the person was living or dead, remained unresolved. Grief, Boss argued, required a certain amount of clarity to proceed. Without it, it circled. The concept of ambiguous loss has since been applied to a much wider range of situations than the one that generated it, to estrangement, to dementia, to the particular quality of losing contact with someone who is still, somewhere, alive. Researchers working on cases of delayed correspondence have found it useful when describing what recipients of long late letters report. A letter from a parent who died years ago, arriving unexpectedly, does not fit neatly into the existing narrative of a grief that has already been partially processed. It opens something, not necessarily something painful. The accounts of recipients are various and do not reduce to a single emotional type, but something that the existing framework of the loss had not left room for. The letter brings the person's voice into a room where it had not been for a long time, and the room has changed since the last time they spoke, and the voice does not know this. The letter is addressed to a version of the recipient who no longer entirely exists, and the recipient holds it and reads it and is in some sense both the person the letter was written for and someone who has lived long past that person all at once. In an oral history project that gathered accounts from recipients of delayed wartime letters, a researcher recorded a conversation with an elderly woman who had received in her 60s a letter her father had written during the Second World War. The letter had spent several decades misfiled in a regional postal archive before being discovered during a records consolidation project. It arrived at her address in a plain envelope with a note explaining its provenance. The researcher described placing the recording equipment on the table between them, beginning the session, and asking the woman to describe what had happened when the letter arrived. She held the question for a long time. Then she said that the thing she was not prepared for was not anything the letter said, it was the handwriting. She had not seen his handwriting since she was a child, and she had not known she remembered it. When she saw the envelope, with his name in the return address corner and the address written in his hand, she knew who it was before she read a single word, and the knowing came from somewhere that was not thought, from somewhere that predated thought, from somewhere in the long years of childhood when that handwriting had meant that he was in the room, or had been in the room recently, or was coming back. The particular relationship between handwriting and recognition is not simply sentimental. Visual cortex research has found that long familiar visual patterns are processed through pathways that involve memory consolidation in ways that novel visual information does not. A handwriting style encountered thousands of times in childhood in the context of letters, notes, lists, cards has been encoded and re-encoded across years of repetition in ways that make its recognition faster and more emotionally immediate than the recognition of words the same mind has encountered just as frequently in printed form. When that handwriting reappears after a long absence, the recognition is not an act of deliberate recollection. It is something that happens before deliberate thought arrives. The paper has barely unfolded, and the mind has already placed itself back in the time when that handwriting was ordinary and daily, when seeing it was not remarkable at all. Researchers studying this phenomenon in laboratory conditions have noted that the gap between visual recognition of a familiar handwriting pattern and the arrival of the associated emotional state is measurable in milliseconds and is consistent across subjects. What varies considerably between individuals is what happens after that initial recognition, how the emotional state is understood, framed, and processed. Some recipients of delayed letters from deceased individuals describe the experience as a kind of comfort. Others describe it as disorienting. Others describe it as both at once, in a combination that they did not have existing language for, and that resisted reduction to either term. What is consistent across the accounts is the speed and involuntariness of the initial response. The handwriting recognizes you before you have decided how to feel about it. There is a documented legal dimension to delayed correspondence that sits at an unusual intersection between the emotional and the procedural. Several cases have been recorded in British probate courts in which letters containing informal expressions of testamentary intent arrived at their destinations after estates had already been settled. The letters were not formal wills and were not treated as such by the courts in every instance, but they described, in the particular shorthand of personal correspondence, the half-sentences, the asides, the references to conversations the writer assumed the recipient remembered, what the writer had wanted done with specific pieces of property, or had wanted said to specific people, or had wanted acknowledged, or forgiven, or remembered. These letters arrived into situations that had been legally resolved. The estate had been distributed, the property had changed hands, the accounts had been closed, and the letter came, months or years later, and said something that did not fit what had already been decided. In at least 2 documented cases, the arrival of such letters prompted formal challenges in British probate proceedings. The court's handling of these challenges was, in each case, careful and ultimately practical. Informal correspondence does not carry the weight of a witnessed will, and the disruption to settled estates, that treating every late arriving letter as a testamentary document would cause was clearly considered. But the legal discussion that surrounded these cases touched on something that the proceedings themselves could not fully resolve, which was the question of what a letter's authority is when the person who wrote it is gone. A letter from the living is a message. A letter from the dead is something else, not quite a will, not quite a conversation, not quite a document, occupying a category of its own, for which neither the law nor the grieving have fully adequate frameworks. The families involved in these proceedings did not, by the accounts that filtered into public record, describe their primary experience as a legal one. The legal challenge was the form that the situation required them to take. Underneath it was something simpler and harder to process, which was that a person they had buried had subsequently written to them, not literally, but the letter felt like that. The person they had grieved and processed and placed into the past had sent something forward into a time they did not live to see, and it had arrived, and it said things that needed to be addressed, and there was no longer any way to address them with the person who had written them. The conversation the letter invited could not take place. The probate court was the nearest available substitute. Therapists and counselors who have worked with recipients of delayed correspondence have noted in several published case accounts that the grief response triggered by a late arriving letter does not always map neatly onto the grief response that the death itself produced. The death, when it occurred, was processed in the context of everything that was known at the time, the circumstances, the relationship as it stood in that moment, the things that had been said, and the things that had not been said. The letter, arriving later, often contains information that does not fit that context. It describes plans that were made and not kept. It mentions things the writer was hoping for that did not come to pass. It refers to the recipient in ways that reflect the relationship as the writer understood it at the time of writing, which may be different from the relationship as it stood at the time of death. The letter is from the past, but it is from a specific past, a particular moment, a particular version of both the writer and the reader, and when it arrives in the present, it brings that moment with it, intact, into a world that has moved considerably further on. One therapist, whose session notes were included in a published case study with the client's consent, described working with a client who had received a letter written by a deceased parent several years after the death. The parent had written the letter during a period of illness, apparently intending to send it, but never doing so. It was found by a sibling clearing the parent's belongings and forwarded. What the therapist observed in the sessions that followed was that the client's grief response was not primarily to the content of the letter, to what the parent had written, or said, or not said, or asked for, or offered. The grief response was to the handwriting, specifically to the way the parent had formed certain letters, the lowercase curve of a particular vowel, the way a specific consonant connected to the letter that followed it. The client described this not as something they had thought about before receiving the letter, not as something they had known they remembered. It surfaced in the reading. The handwriting carried something that the content of the letter did not have to carry, because it was already there, already inside the client, waiting in a register of memory that had not been accessed since the last time that particular curve of a lowercase vowel had appeared on a page in that client's field of vision. The therapist noted in the published account that this kind of grief reactivation, triggered not by narrative content, but by a visual pattern so deeply encoded that its recognition bypasses conscious thought, was consistent with what bereavement research had described in cases involving other sensory anchors, particularly smell. The limbic system does not distinguish between stimuli in the way the conscious mind does. A familiar scent does not mean the same kind of thing that a familiar sentence means. It means something more immediate and less verbal than that, something closer to the presence itself rather than the representation of the presence. Handwriting, in long familiar cases, appears to work similarly. The loops and connections are not read, they are recognized. The recognition is not a thought, it is something closer to arrival. There is something that archivists and museum professionals have long known informally, and that researchers have more recently begun to document, about the difference between reading about an historical period and holding a document from it. The distinction is not simply one of preference or sentiment. It appears to be structural. When a visitor to an archival reading room lifts an original letter from its acid-free folder and holds it, even through gloves, something happens that does not happen when the same visitor reads a transcription of the same letter on a printed page or a screen. The reported experience is consistently different. The feeling of connection, not to the information in the letter, but to the period in which it was written, to the person who wrote it, to the physical world those words inhabited, is reported as significantly stronger when the original object is in the hand. Researchers at several institutions have begun to investigate what underlies this difference, and the findings are not yet complete. Part of it appears to be what is sometimes called the indexical quality of the original document, the fact that the ink on this specific sheet of paper was laid down by this specific person's hand, that the document is not a representation of the event, but the event itself, still persisting in physical form. Part of it appears to be the sensory detail of the original object, the slight texture of the paper, the faint smell of aged ink, the near-invisible ridges left by the pen's pressure, none of which survive in reproduction. And part of it appears to be something more difficult to name, something in the knowing that this exact object has traveled through time, from that moment to this one, has been held by or near the hands of the people who sent and received it, has survived, while many of the things that surrounded it have not. A letter in an archival box, held in a reading room on an ordinary working afternoon, is in a real sense still in transit. It left one set of hands and has not yet found its final resting place. It is being read, again, by someone who was not the intended recipient. The archivist who returns it to its folder and closes the box knows that it will be read again by someone else, At some point, the box cannot anticipate. The letter is still going about its business. It has been carrying its particular version of one person's voice and handwriting and specific way of forming words through time for decades or a century, and it is not finished yet. The reading room on a quiet Tuesday afternoon is not the letter's end, it is a stop along the way. A researcher in an archival reading room describes the work of lifting a letter from its protective tissue and examining it as one of the more quietly absorbing aspects of historical work. Not because the contents are always remarkable, often they are not. A letter from a soldier to his sister, discussing the weather and requesting socks, contains no revelation and resolves no historical question. But it is in his hand, the particular angle of the pen, the abbreviations he used for words he wrote, often, the place where the nib caught slightly on the paper and left a small thickening of the line. These are things that no other document in the world contains in quite the same combination, and they were made by a specific person on a specific day in a specific posture at a specific surface, and that person did not know and could not have known that this is where the letter would eventually come to rest, in this reading room, in this particular afternoon light, in the hands of someone wearing cotton gloves who is trying to understand what his regiment did in the autumn of the year he wrote it. The researcher sets the letter down, takes a note, looks at it for a moment longer, then slides it carefully back into the acid-free tissue, folds the tissue over it, closes the folder, and sets it on the stack to be returned to the box. The letter has been read, in the folder, in the box, in the temperature-controlled quiet of the room. It will wait for the next reading. It is very patient about this. Letters, once they have set out, tend to be patient. They wait in sorting machines. They wait behind walls. They wait in misfiled folders, in archives that have not been opened in 20 years. They wait in the particular darkness of closed boxes in climate-controlled rooms, with the tissue folded neatly over them for whoever is coming next. The gift that handwriting carries, which print cannot carry in the same way, and which digital text cannot carry at all, is evidence of a body. The letter was made by a hand that had a temperature and a weight and a particular way of resting against a desk surface. The hand belonged to a person who was, in the moment of writing, somewhere specific, at a table, in a chair, in a room that had a smell and a quality of light and whatever sounds were moving through it from outside the window. All of that is gone, but the letter moved through it. The letter was there, and the letter is still here, in the reading room, in the archive box, in the acid-free tissue, slightly worn at the fold lines, the ink still dark enough to read, the handwriting still carrying the trace of that particular hand's particular way of moving across a surface, still as individual and unrepeatable as the person who made it. When the museum visitor sets the letter carefully back into its folder, smoothing the acid-free tissue over it, and closes the box, the afternoon continues around it. Other researchers work at other tables. A cart of materials moves through the room. A door opens and closes somewhere along the corridor. The letter rests in its particular darkness, the way it has rested through other darknesses, in other places, across the years it has been traveling. It is not waiting for anything. Exactly. It has no purpose that requires completion. It is simply there, holding what it holds, in the quiet of the closed box, in the temperature-controlled room, in the building that will stand through several more seasons before it is anyone's particular concern again. And it will remain there, in that specific fold of time between readings, until the next person comes with the right credentials, and the right request, and the white cotton gloves, and the box is opened again, and the tissue is unfolded, and the letter is lifted into the light. In the dead letter office in Washington, D.C., in the 1890s, the working day had a particular sound. It was the sound of paper, letter knives moving through envelope flaps, one after another, the soft resistance of the gummed seal giving way, the dry rustle of a folded sheet being opened out flat on a wide wooden table. The room was large. The tables were arranged in long rows under windows that let in whatever light the season offered, and in winter that light arrived low and pale and did not last long into the afternoon. Clerks sat at intervals along the tables, each with a ledger open to one side and a growing pile of opened envelopes to the other. The smell was of paper and dust, and the faint mineral smell that old ink leaves in an enclosed space, a smell that builds in rooms where paper has been accumulating for years and cannot be fully aired out. The office had existed in some form since the early years of the Postal Service, but it was formally organized in 1825 under Postmaster General John McLean, who gave it its structure and its statutory authority to open mail that could not be delivered and could not be returned. The name was accurate in several senses. These were letters that had failed to arrive. They were, in the language of the post, dead. What the clerks did each day was a kind of careful cataloging of that failure, working through envelope after envelope, recording what was inside before the holding period expired, and the contents were disposed of according to the rules governing each category. The contents were not what might be expected from a room dealing in administrative failure. Former clerks writing about the office in the 1890s described discovering currency folded inside letters, banknotes of various denominations pressed flat between sheets of notepaper. There were small pieces of jewelry, rings, lockets, the occasional brooch, sent as gifts or tokens that had never reached the person they were meant for. There were hand-drawn maps, detailed enough in some cases to suggest that whoever had drawn them had gone to considerable trouble, sketching in landmarks and distances with the particular care of someone trying to make a place legible to someone who had never seen it. There were confessions, not perhaps confessions in the formal sense, but letters that amounted to one, a person writing down something they had not been able to say in another form, sending it out through the postal system, and having it arrive here instead, on a wooden table in Washington, D.C., to be opened by a stranger who would make a note of its contents in a ledger and then move on to the next envelope. The clerk's task was methodical. Each item was described, each description was entered, currency was noted by denomination and total value. Jewelry was recorded by type and approximate character, not appraised, simply named. The ledger entry for a particular envelope might read, in the careful handwriting of a post office clerk in 1893, something like, 1 letter, 2 pages, no legible address. Contents include one $5 bill and a pencil sketch of a house with a name written at the top. The name was recorded too, and then the letter joined the others in the holding category to which it belonged, and the clerk reached for the next envelope. The statutory holding periods varied by content type. Currency held longest because the chance that a banknote could be matched to a sender was considered worth extending. Yet objects of obvious personal value were held for set periods, and then, depending on the category, either auctioned, melted if they were metal, or destroyed. Documents were reviewed for legibility and then cataloged. The ledgers themselves were kept. So the record of the things that had been lost was preserved even after the things themselves were gone, which is a particular kind of archive, an index of absence, a list of what once existed and was sent and did not arrive, maintained with care by a government office in a large room that smelled of paper and dust. Herman Melville had written about the dead letter office in 1853, his short story about a copyist named Bartleby, a man who gradually stops doing any of the tasks he is asked to do and eventually stops doing anything at all, ends with a rumor about the character's past. The narrator learns that Bartleby had previously worked at the dead letter office, and the suggestion hangs at the close of the story that a man who spent his working hours handling letters that never reached their destinations, accumulating evidence of failed communication day after day, might eventually find it difficult to communicate at all. Melville's use of the office was not accidental. By 1853, the dead letter office was well enough established in American cultural life to carry the weight Melville put on it, to function as a symbol without needing explanation, to mean something to readers who understood immediately what kind of place it was and what kind of work was done there. By the 1890s, the office had expanded considerably. The volume of mail passing through the American postal system had grown with the country, and the volume of undeliverable mail had grown proportionally. The clerks working through the accumulated envelopes on any given afternoon were engaged in a task that would not be finished today, or tomorrow, or the week after. There was always more. The mail continued arriving in the undeliverable stream, letters that had been addressed to people who had moved or died, or could not be found at the address given, letters with addresses so incomplete that no carrier could act on them, letters damaged enough in transit that the address was no longer legible. The room continued its particular sound. Paper opened, ledgers filled. The pale winter light moved across the tables and then receded, and the clerks worked on into the shortening afternoon. The modern successor to that room is in Atlanta, Georgia. The Mail Recovery Center, as it is now called, handles what remains after every other effort at delivery and return has been exhausted. The volume is considerable. Millions of pieces of undeliverable mail arrive at the facility each year, routed there from post offices and distribution centers across the country when addresses cannot be read or found, and no return address is available to send the item back to its origin. The building is large and well lit and operates on a working day that is nothing like the gaslit Washington room of the 1890s. But the fundamental task is the same. Items that arrive at the center without legible addresses are open. The reason for opening them is the same reason Melville's clerks open theirs. Somewhere inside the letter or package, there may be information that makes delivery possible. A return address on a check folded inside a birthday card, a name and phone number on a gift note inside a package, a business card slipped in among photographs sent to someone whose address the post office can no longer read. The center's clerks work through these items methodically, looking for the identifying thread that might allow the thing to reach the person it was meant for. When that thread exists, they follow it. When it does not, the item enters the next stage of the center's process, which is the holding period. And after that, for items that have accumulated value in the monetary or material sense, the auction. The Mail Recovery Center in Atlanta periodically holds public auctions of unclaimed valuables recovered from undeliverable mail. Jewelry appears, electronics appear, items of obvious personal significance appear, items whose value is not monetary in any clear way, but whose presence in an auction lot raises the question of what story preceded this, what gift was packed and addressed and sent and never arrived, what series of small failures brought it here to a public auction floor in Georgia. The auction is a practical mechanism. It is also, in its particular way, the final administrative act in a chain of events that began when someone addressed an envelope and dropped it into a collection box somewhere in the country, expecting it to arrive. The center does not keep a public record of the stories behind the items it handles. The ledger tradition of the 1890s has not carried forward in that form. What remains is the inventory, the practical accounting of what the facility processes and what becomes of it, which is not the same as knowing where any of it came from or what it was meant to mean when it was sent. There have been cases in the long history of the American postal system where mail did not fail to arrive because of institutional process or random damage, but because someone working inside the system had removed it from that process deliberately. In 1978, postal inspectors in Chicago discovered a quantity of undelivered mail that had been hidden in a garage rented by a postal worker. The mail had not been delivered. It had been taken from the route and stored, bags and bundles of it, stacked against the walls of the rented space over a period estimated at somewhere between 2 and 3 years. When the inspectors entered the garage, the envelopes were slightly damp from the temperature variations and unheated garage experiences through Chicago winters and summers, but a significant portion of them were otherwise intact. The discovery was the result of a postal inspection, which is the standard mechanism for identifying anomalies in mail flow. When delivery records show consistent gaps, when the volume of undeliverable returns from a particular route doesn't account for the shortfall in delivery confirmations, the inspection process begins. In this case, it ended in a Chicago garage on an ordinary day in 1978. The inspectors moving through a space that had accumulated several years of other people's correspondence, stacked in the dimness, the envelopes in the same state they had been in when they were removed from the route, addressed, sealed, stamped, waiting. Some of the letters in that garage were eventually delivered to their recipients, years late. The records do not indicate how many or what the recipients said when they received them. The suppression itself was documented, investigated, and resolved through the systems designed to handle exactly that kind of failure. The letters that could be delivered were delivered. The ones that could not be identified or matched were processed through whatever stage of the system their condition allowed. The garage was emptied, and the case was closed. What the 1978 discovery illustrates, in a practical sense, is that the postal system's failure modes are various. Mail is lost when equipment breaks. Mail is lost when addresses are incomplete. Mail is lost in transit, through damage, through weather, through the ordinary attrition of objects moving through an imperfect physical infrastructure. And occasionally, mail is lost because of deliberate human action, because someone inside the system removed it from the stream for reasons that the records do not always clarify. The inspection process exists to find these cases, and it does find them, though not always quickly and not always in time for the finding to matter to the people who were waiting. The postal inspection reports from the 1978 Chicago case noted the volume of suppressed mail in terms of bags and estimated pieces, the way such reports do in the language of administrative accounting. The letters inside those bags were correspondence between people, between family members and employers and friends and institutions, ordinary mail of the kind that moves through the system in enormous quantities every day and is largely invisible until it fails to arrive. The inspection report noted the volume. It did not note the contents because the contents were not the inspector's concern. Their concern was the system and the breach in it, and the system was what they documented. In the summer and fall of 2020, the postal system's failure modes became visible in a different way. First-class mail, that the Postal Service's own standards required to arrive within 5 days was taking 10 days or more to reach its destination in some parts of the country. The delays were widespread enough and consistent enough to be documented by the Postal Service's own Office of Inspector General, which issued reports detailing the scope of the slowdown and its causes. The reports described a combination of factors: changes to operational procedures, equipment adjustments at sorting facilities, and the increased pressure on the system from the particular demands of that period. A postal worker finishing a shift in the autumn of 2020, with a portion of the day's deliveries still unmade, would have documented the undelivered mail in a delay report, a standardized form recording the items that had not reached their destinations and the reason why. The mail itself would have been returned to the vehicle or to the facility, held overnight, and added to the following day's load. The delay reports accumulated. The Inspector General reports were based on those accumulations, on the aggregate picture that emerged when individual delay reports were compiled across regions and periods into a pattern legible at the institutional level. From the perspective of a person expecting a piece of first-class mail in October of 2020, the experience was simpler. The letter did not arrive when it was supposed to arrive. It arrived later. In some cases, considerably later. The systemic reasons for that delay were being tracked and documented in government reports, but the experience of waiting was a private matter, a small gap in the expected flow of ordinary life, noticed and then, eventually, closed when the letter came. The postal system's history is a history of these gaps, running alongside the history of its enormous and mostly invisible success. On any given day in the United States, hundreds of millions of pieces of mail move through the system and arrive where they are supposed to arrive. The gaps are documented because they are the exceptions, because the system that carries the mail also carries the mechanisms for recording where it fails. The Dead Letter Office was itself a documentation of failure, a permanent institutional structure for managing the portion of the flow that did not reach its destination, built into the postal system from almost its beginning. The 1825 Act that formalized the Dead Letter Office, under Postmaster General McLean, was not the creation of something new, so much as the formalization of something that had already been happening in a less organized way. Mail had been going undeliverable since the first post roads opened. Clerks had been setting aside undeliverable items long before 1825. What the Act did was give that practice a defined procedure, a statutory holding period, a requirement to keep records. It turned an informal accommodation into a system, with all the permanence that a system brings. The ledgers from the Washington, D.C. Dead Letter Office in the late 19th century still exist in archival collections. They record, in columns of careful handwriting, the contents of thousands of envelopes that arrived at the office during those years and were opened by clerks who made their entries and moved on to the next one. Reading those ledgers now is an exercise in the particular kind of strangeness that old administrative records produce, documents that were created entirely for functional, practical purposes, intended to track items and periods and dispositions, and that now read as something more than that, as evidence of a communication that occurred between a person and the postal system, and ended here, in an entry in a ledger, in a room in Washington, D.C., in the handwriting of a clerk whose name may or may not appear anywhere in the same archive. The entry that reads, in one case from the early 1890s, something like 1 letter, 3 pages, handwriting not legible in full. Contents include a folded banknote and a drawing of a building, no further identifying detail. That entry is everything that remains of whatever that letter was, whatever it was trying to do when it was sent. The note, the drawing, the banknote, all of those are gone. The holding period expired, the statutory process concluded, but the ledger entry remains, and the ledger itself sits in an archival collection, and the entry is still readable to anyone who looks. Melville's clerk in the story is imagined holding a ring. It is a ring that was sent as a gift, as a token of love or attachment, addressed to someone who could not be found at the address given and could not be returned to whoever sent it. The clerk holds it for a moment before placing it in the tray where unclaimed valuables are collected. The ring will be cataloged, held for the statutory period, and then, if no claim has been made, melted or auctioned or disposed of through whatever mechanism the rules provide. The moment Melville describes, the clerk holding the ring, the brief pause before it goes into the tray, is imagined rather than documented, a fictional reconstruction of what that daily encounter with accumulated loss might have felt like for a person doing it hour after hour. But the clerks were real, the trays were real, the rings were real. The process described, the cataloging and holding and eventual disposal, was entirely accurate to how the office operated. The fiction is in the pause, the moment of the clerk's recognition before the ring goes into the tray. That is Melville's addition, the literary moment inserted into the administrative record. Whether the actual clerks paused, whether they felt anything like what Melville suggests, is not in the ledgers. The ledgers record what was found, not what finding it felt like. That is the nature of administrative record keeping, and it is also, perhaps, the nature of work that involves processing enormous volumes of the same kind of thing every day after some number of envelopes. The pause, if it was ever there, may not be a reliable event. The Atlanta facility operates today on a scale the Washington, D.C. office of the 1890s could not have handled. The machinery is different. The volume is different. The procedures have been formalized and updated through successive generations of postal regulation, but the fundamental shape of the operation is unchanged. Mail arrives that cannot be delivered and cannot be returned. It is opened and examined. It is held, and then it is disposed of through whatever process the rules governing that category require. The system for managing lost mail is itself a permanent feature of the postal system, as old as the postal system in any organized form, built into it because without that structure, the failure mode has no resolution. On an ordinary afternoon in the Mail Recovery Center in Atlanta, the loading docks receive pallets of accumulated undeliverable items from distribution centers around the country, and the sorting aisles fill with the quiet movement of clerks working through the volume, and the process continues in the way that processes built into the structure of a large institution continue, without fanfare, without announcement, in the ordinary ongoing rhythm of work being done inside a lit building on a working day. The mail arrives, it is examined, some of it finds its way to a destination, some of it does not, and enters the holding sequence, and waits out the period the rules set for items of its type. The ledger, in whatever form the institution now uses, is updated. The system is not a closed story. It is a permanent operation running alongside the postal system's primary function. The way a water treatment facility runs alongside a water supply, visible when something fails, largely invisible when everything is working, necessary in either case. Letters that were posted with good intentions and correct addresses move through it without knowing they are there. Letters that have lost their way arrive and are handled with methodical attention. The clerks who open them are doing work that was being done in the same essential form in Washington, D.C. in the 1870s, and before that in less formalized ways, wherever the postal system existed in any shape at all. Outside the Atlanta building, On the afternoon in question, the Postal Service moves in the way it always moves: trucks on routes, carriers on streets, the vast daily operation of a system that handles its volume in such a way that the volume, most of the time, is invisible. The letters that are not lost are not visible as letters moving through a system. They are visible only when they arrive, appearing through a slot or in a box, their transit unremarked upon and unremarkable, which is the sign that the system has worked. The ones that do not arrive are the ones that generate records. The delay reports, the inspection reports, the ledger entries, the auction catalogs, all of it is documentation of the portion of the flow that did not complete. The documentation is extensive because the postal system has always maintained the habit, going back to John McLean and the 1825 Act, and before that to the informal practices of the earliest post offices, of keeping track of its failures in detail. The archive of failure is in its way more complete than the archive of success, because success leaves no record beyond the fact of having occurred, while failure generates paperwork. The ledger entry from the 1890s for the letter with the drawing of a house is still there. The letter itself is not, the drawing is not. The name written at the top of the drawing, whatever name it was, is preserved only in that single entry, in the handwriting of a clerk who is doing his job on an ordinary afternoon in the room with the long tables and the gaslight and the smell of paper and dust. The room in Atlanta continues its work tonight, as it continues every night that falls on a working day. The accumulated undeliverable mail of a country still being worked through in the lit building, still being opened and examined and entered into whatever the current form of the ledger is, still being held in the orderly sequence of a system that has been running in one form or another since before Melville wrote his clerk into a story and gave him a ring to hold for a moment before letting it go. The mail arrives. It is sorted. What can be delivered is, what cannot is held. The holding does not last forever, and neither does the holding room, though the institution that runs it has lasted longer than any of the individual rooms it has occupied, longer than the gaslit Washington, D.C. office, longer than the particular clerks whose handwriting fills the ledgers in the archival collection, longer, in all probability, than the Chicago garage and the inspection that emptied it. The institution continues. The Atlanta building is lit on an ordinary evening, its loading docks, quiet now that the day's deliveries from the distribution centers have arrived, its sorting aisles settling into the particular stillness of a working space. At the end of a shift, the accumulated mail of the day's intake sitting in its organized rows, waiting for tomorrow's clerks to begin working through it again. The process is not completed today. It is not designed to be completed today. It is designed to continue in the reliable, ongoing way that institutional processes continue when they are built to last, which this one has been. The system for finding lost letters is itself a permanent, ongoing thing. It receives what the larger system cannot deliver, holds it with the methodical attention of a clerk who has done this work long enough to understand that the ledger entry matters even when the letter does not arrive, and continues in that quiet way, on lit afternoons and into evenings, in Atlanta, in a building that most of the people whose mail passes through it will never have occasion to think about, doing its ordinary, careful, persistent work. In the spring of 1922, a bundle of letters arrived at a house in London. They had come a long way. They had crossed the South Atlantic in a mail packet, been transferred at a port somewhere along the route, and traveled on through ordinary postal channels until they reached their destination on an ordinary morning, the envelopes slightly worn at the corners. the handwriting on the outside familiar and clear. The woman who received them knew the handwriting well. She had been reading it for years. What she also knew by the time those letters arrived was that the man who had written them was gone. Ernest Shackleton had died on the 5th of January, 1922, on the island of South Georgia in the sub-Antarctic. He had been aboard the Quest, a small converted Norwegian sealer, preparing for what would prove to be his final expedition. His wife Emily was in London when the news reached her. The letters she received in the weeks and months that followed had been written before his death, posted from various points along the voyage's early route, and they traveled home through the ordinary machinery of international mail, while Emily was already, quietly, beginning to live inside a different kind of knowledge. The letters described a man in good spirits, a man making plans, a man riding forward into a future he fully expected to inhabit. The particular quality of that experience, holding a letter from someone whose absence is already certain, reading words composed in a time before that certainty existed, is something that the postal record of the 20th century returned to again and again in different forms, in different places, through different hands. It is not a rare kind of occurrence. It is, in fact, one of the predictable consequences of the way correspondence travels, at the speed of ships and planes and postal routes, which is to say at a speed slightly behind the speed of events. Letters have always had the capacity to arrive from one time into another, carrying their original moment with them intact. Shackleton's final letters were not lost. They were not delayed by any failure of the system. They arrived on schedule, having been posted from the ports and anchorages of the early voyage, and they reached Emily in London in the order in which they had been written, so that she would have read them watching the voyage unfold, knowing all the while how it had ended. The later letters, those written closest to his death, would have described him most fully as he was in those last weeks, energetic, forward-looking, already considering what the expedition might find and where it might go next. The handwriting on those final envelopes would have been as confident as any he had ever produced. The Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge holds a significant portion of Shackleton's correspondence and personal papers. The letters are archived in temperature-controlled conditions, the pages lying flat in their acid-free folders, the ink dark against the paper as it was the day it was applied. On any given afternoon, a researcher working in the archive reading room might lift one of those letters from its folder and read, in Shackleton's own hand, words addressed to Emily about the cold, about the sea, about the men on the voyage, about what he intended to do and where he intended to go. The words are still fully present. Nothing in them has diminished. Whatever Shackleton meant when he wrote those lines, he meant it completely, and the letters carry that completeness forward into every reading, however many years have passed. Among the letters that endured in unusual ways, some arrived late because the systems that were meant to carry them failed partway through the journey. Others arrived late because the circumstances in which they were written made their immediate delivery impossible, and some were simply held in the dark for reasons that no single explanation fully covers, placed somewhere, forgotten, left to wait. The archival record of the 20th century is thick with examples of each kind. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds letters written by Australian soldiers at Gallipoli in 1915. Some of those letters were composed in the hours before an assault, or in the brief stillness between actions on a section of the front where the fighting was continuous and the outcomes uncertain. The men who wrote them knew they might not survive what was coming. Some of them did not. The letters they left behind passed through the ordinary military postal channels of the period, reaching families in New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland weeks or months after they were written, and the families read them in the context of whatever news had arrived by other means, which might already have included official notification of a death. Those letters entered archival collections in the decades that followed, cataloged and stored, held in the conditions that preservation required. For a long time, the specific contents of many of them were not widely known outside specialist military history research. The letters existed in the archive, available in principle but unexamined in practice, sitting in their boxes through the decades in which the last veterans of the campaign grew old and died, and the direct personal connection to the peninsula faded from living memory into historical record. Digitization projects in the 2000s changed the character of that access. When the letters were scanned and made available through the memorial's online collections, researchers and members of the public who had previously had no practical way to consult the originals could read them on screen in detail. The pencil handwriting, legible on high-resolution images, the folds and worn edges of the paper visible in the scans. A letter written in a dugout above Anzac Cove in May or June of 1915 by a man who may have known that the day he was writing into was one of the last he would have, became readable to his great-grandchildren on an ordinary afternoon more than 90 years later. The pencil handwriting in those letters is worth pausing on. A fountain pen required a stable writing surface and ink that did not run or smear under field conditions. Pencil was practical. It could be used at any angle, in any weather, in the brief periods when writing was possible at all. The graphite lines in those Gallipoli letters, pressed into the paper by a hand that was working quickly and in uncertain light, have remained legible through the full length of the century and into the next one. Whatever the writer intended, whatever he was trying to say to the person on the other side of the letter, whatever he wanted them to know about where he was and how he felt and what he hoped for, that intention is still fully visible in the marks on the page if anyone reads closely enough to see it. The Casa Azul in Coyoacan, on the southern edge of Mexico City, is the house where Frida Kahlo was born, where she lived and worked through most of her adult life, and where she died on the 13th of July, 1954. After her death, a particular room in the house, her personal bathroom, was sealed. The sealing was in accordance with her wishes, though accounts of exactly what those wishes specified and how they were communicated vary in their particulars. What is consistent across the historical record is that the bathroom remained closed for 50 years, the door shut against the ordinary traffic of the house, and the museum it became, the room on the other side undisturbed through 5 decades of Mexican summers and winters, through the traffic of the street outside, through the changes the neighborhood underwent as the city grew around it. When the bathroom was opened in 2004, researchers found approximately 6,000 personal objects. The count and categorization of those objects formed a significant archival undertaking in its own right. Among them were letters, personal correspondence that had been in the room when the door was sealed and that had remained there, lying where it had been placed, for the full half-century of the closure. The love letters among them were written by and to Kahlo across the years of her adult life, in the particular emotional circumstances of her relationships, in the specific handwriting of the people who had sent them, and in her own handwriting on the drafts and copies she had retained. They had been in the room the whole time, while the museum opened and operated in the rest of the house, while visitors moved through the studio and the courtyard and the rooms open to the public. Those letters were in the sealed bathroom, in the dark, waiting. The word waiting is not quite right, Letters do not wait in any active sense, do not experience the time they spend in the dark as duration. What they do is persist. They remain unchanged in whatever condition the moment of their writing left them, while the time around them accumulates. When researchers opened the Casa Azul bathroom in 2004 and began cataloging what they found, the letters they handled had been sealed inside that room since a July afternoon 50 years before. The ink on them, the paper, the handwriting, all of it was as it had been on the day Kahlo placed it there, or on the day the door was finally closed for the last time. Nothing in the letters had changed. The only thing that had changed was everything outside them. The letters discovered in archival collections by accident occupy a different category. They were not sealed deliberately. They were not placed somewhere and forgotten by the people who placed them. They simply ended up in locations where they were not expected to be, filed under headings that did not describe them accurately, stored alongside material of an entirely different kind, and overlooked for years or decades until someone moved through the archive with enough care and close attention to notice something that did not belong to the category it was stored in. In 2007, a researcher examining a county courthouse archive in Illinois came across a misfiled folder in a collection of routine legal documents. The documents around it were the ordinary administrative paperwork of a working law practice: case notes, receipts, correspondence with clients, the regular record of a busy attorney's daily work. The misfiled folder contained a letter. The letter was handwritten. At the bottom of the letter, in the ink of what was most likely a winter afternoon, was the signature of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln practiced law in Illinois for more than 2 decades before his entry into national politics, and the volume of paperwork his practice generated was substantial. He wrote hundreds of letters in his capacity as an attorney, and those letters were distributed across the practices and archives of the clients and opposing parties and courts he worked with throughout his career. A significant number of them have been cataloged, studied, and preserved. But the nature of any working legal archive is that its contents are organized for practical purposes, not for historical completeness, and documents that do not fit neatly into the organizational system of a particular collection can sit in the wrong place for a very long time before anyone looks closely enough to recognize what they are. The letter found in 2007 had been in that courthouse archive for well over a century. The building above it had been in use throughout those years for the purposes county courthouses are built for: the ordinary administrative business of county government, the filing and retrieval of legal records, the accumulation of the documentation that property and law and civic organization require. Lincoln's letter had sat in its misfiled folder through all of it, through the decades during which his presidency became historical memory, and then established history, and then the subject of the documentary record that archivists and historians work with professionally. No one had looked at it because no one had had reason to look at that particular folder, in that particular collection, in that particular courthouse archive, with the specific attention that would have allowed them to see what was there. When the researcher unfolded it and found the signature at the bottom, the moment of recognition would have been a quiet one, not dramatic, not accompanied by any sound other than the faint noise of the archive room itself. Whatever ventilation system kept the conditions stable, the distant noise of the county going about its business outside. The signature was simply there, as it had always been, waiting, and again, waiting is not quite the right word, simply present, in the ink in which it had been applied on a day more than 150 years before. There is something in the particular materiality of Lincoln's handwriting that researchers and archivists who work with it Describe with a specific attention the pressure of the nib on the paper, the characteristic letter forms, the particular way certain letters connect to the ones that follow them. These are not romantic details imposed after the fact. They are the observable features of a specific hand, doing what any person's hand does when it writes, leaving a record that is, in some technical and documentary sense, irreducibly individual, a set of marks that no other hand would have made in exactly that configuration. The letter found in 2007 carried all of those marks, undimmed, through the full length of its years in the archive. Among the letters that crossed the most distance in the most complicated circumstances, those written by soldiers and dispatched from theaters of war, occupied a particular place in the documentary history of the 20th century. The conditions in which such letters were written, the systems through which they traveled, and the circumstances in which they were received combined to give them a character that peacetime correspondence rarely achieved. They were written under pressure, often in brief windows of available time, often with awareness of the censorship systems they would pass through and of the anxieties that awaited them at the other end. They carried their original moment with unusual concentration, because the moment was one in which the writer was fully present in ways that ordinary civilian life rarely required. The Gallipoli letters in the Australian War Memorials collection exemplify this. The men who wrote them were on a peninsula that had become famous in a very short time for the intensity and cost of its fighting. They were writing to families who were reading the newspapers and following the campaign with the particular attention of people who had someone there. The letters they sent were personal documents, but they were also dispatches from a place that the whole country was thinking about, and they carried that double weight, the weight of the personal and the weight of the historical, in the ordinary lines of their handwriting. The process by which those letters reached their destinations was not straightforward. Military mail moved through a collection and sorting system separate from civilian postal infrastructure, traveling by ship from the Gallipoli Peninsula to Egypt and then onward to Australia, a journey that took weeks even under the best conditions. Censorship added delays. The volume of mail generated by a force of tens of thousands of men put pressure on the system at every stage. The result was that letters arrived in clusters and out of order, so that a family might receive, on the same afternoon, several letters that had been written across a span of weeks, reading them in the order they arrived rather than the order in which they had been composed. The families who received those letters were reading them in a different kind of time from the one in which they had been written. By the time a letter arrived in Sydney or Melbourne, the day on which it had been written at Gallipoli was weeks in the past. Whatever had happened on that day, whatever had followed it, the letter was already a historical document in a modest sense, a record of a moment that had ended before the reading began. If subsequent letters had not arrived, or if official notification of some kind had reached the family through other channels, the last letter in the sequence took on the character that Shackleton's final letters carried, the voice of someone writing forward into a future that the reader already knew had not unfolded as described. Some of those letters are in the archive now. They sit in their boxes in the conditions that preservation requires. The pencil handwriting still clear on the paper, the folds worn soft from the many times they were unfolded and refolded in the first months after their arrival. Researchers who work with them handle them with cotton gloves, lifting them from their acid-free folders carefully, holding them in the light to read the portions that age and wear have made harder to decipher. The letters are not fragile in any dramatic sense. Paper made to reasonable standards a century ago has lasted well, but they are handled as if they were, because they are the only version of themselves that exists, and the care given to them is proportionate to that irreplaceability. In December of 1922, earlier that same year, in which Shackleton's letters were arriving at Emily's London address, a valise was stolen from a train at the Gare de Lyon in Paris. The valise belonged to Hadley Hemingway. And she had packed it with the intention of surprising her husband, Ernest, with the originals of nearly all his early manuscripts, the work he had produced in the years since he arrived in Paris, the material that represented whatever he had managed to accomplish before the accident of theft removed it from the record entirely. The story of what the valise contained has been reconstructed from various accounts, including Hemingway's own, which differ in some particulars and agree in most. What is consistent is that the manuscripts inside it were extensive. Stories, drafts, early attempts at longer work, the range of writing that a young writer in the process of finding his way produces before the finding is complete. With the theft, the originals of all of it vanished, and since Hadley had packed the carbon copies as well, intending to give Ernest everything, the loss was total. Only a few pieces survived, because they happened not to be in the valise when it was taken. The valise itself, wherever it went after the theft, whether it was opened immediately, whether its contents were examined by whoever took it, whether the manuscripts inside were recognized as anything of value, or simply discarded, is not known. The manuscripts did not surface. They have not been found. What the theft created in the documentary record was a gap, a section of Hemingway's early development that exists only in his own accounts and in the memory of the handful of people who had read some of the work before it was lost. What makes the Gare de Lyon story particular is the quality of the image it leaves, a valise sitting somewhere in Paris in December of 1922. Its contents the unpublished pages of a writer who would eventually become one of the most recognized literary figures of the century. The manuscripts inside going nowhere, while the trains of the Gare de Lyon continued their arrivals and departures on schedule. If the valise was placed in a lost property office, it sat there waiting to be claimed. If it was taken somewhere else entirely, the manuscripts it contained sat in whatever condition their new location provided. Either way, there was a period, days perhaps longer, in which the work existed, physically, somewhere in Paris, while Hemingway had not yet been told it was gone. The manuscripts were present in the world for those days, even as they were already, in every practical sense, lost. The documents that persist in the strangest conditions are sometimes the ones that were never intended for archival preservation at all. Letters written quickly, in difficult circumstances, on whatever paper was available, with whatever instrument came to hand, and sent through whatever system was operating at the time, have lasted in some cases through the full length of the century and into the next one. The care given to them was the care of the moment, a pocket, an envelope, a bundle wrapped and addressed and handed to whoever was moving in the right direction. After that, the postal system and whatever followed it determined where they went and how long they stayed there. The Australian War Memorial's Gallipoli collection contains letters of exactly this kind, written in pencil, on paper that was not selected for its archival qualities, in conditions that were the opposite of a careful writing environment, and sent through a military postal system under considerable stress. Those letters have nonetheless lasted. The pencil marks that a hand in a Gallipoli dugout pressed into paper in 1915 are still there, still readable, on a morning in the archive reading room more than a century later. The handwriting belongs to men who are long gone. The words are still present. There is a quality to objects that have lasted a very long time without being intended to last that is different from the quality of objects preserved deliberately. The deliberate preservation, the acid-free folder, the temperature-controlled room, the cotton gloves, is the care given after the fact, once the significance has been recognized and the conditions required to maintain it have been established. Before that recognition, the object simply exists in whatever conditions it finds itself in, making no claim to significance, carrying its content forward through time with the same indifference that any physical object maintains toward the forces acting on it. A letter in a courthouse archive in Illinois in the wrong folder, filed under the wrong heading, does not know it is significant. A letter in a sealed bathroom in Coyoacán does not know it is being preserved. A letter in a dugout on the Gallipoli Peninsula, written by a man in the brief time available to him, does not know whether it will arrive. The letters simply exist in their particular physical form, carrying whatever they carry until someone comes to read them. What they carry does not diminish in the meantime. It waits, and again, it does not wait, not exactly, but it is simply there, unchanged, in the dark or the light or wherever the time has placed it, for however long the time requires. Emily Shackleton received letters from her husband in the months following his death. The last of them would have arrived when the spring had already turned toward summer. The London light changing through the window behind her as she read, the envelopes from the Quest's early ports, all opened and read by then. The full correspondence of the final voyage, processed through whatever she needed to do to process it. The letters described a man who was planning ahead. The letters described a man who expected to return. Whatever Emily did with those letters after she had read them is a matter of record in the archive. They passed, eventually, into the care of the Scott Polar Research Institute, where they now occupy their place in the archival collection alongside the other Shackleton papers. The notebooks and diaries and official correspondence of a man who spent much of his adult life in conditions that did not favor the survival of paper documents. The letters from the Quest survived. They are in Cambridge, on a quiet afternoon, with the light coming through the archive room windows at the angle that archive room windows tend to catch it. A researcher might sit with one of those letters in a cotton glove and read it slowly, the words moving through the same sequence they moved through when Emily read them, the same sentences, the same handwriting, the same forward-looking energy of a man who did not know he was writing toward the end. The Shackleton papers at the Scott Polar Research Institute include letters from various periods of his life, not only the final voyage. Letters from earlier expeditions, letters from the years between expeditions, when he was in London or elsewhere, managing the business of preparing for the next journey, raising money, writing to supporters and sponsors, and the officials of the various bodies whose cooperation his work required. The range of the correspondence is the range of a particular kind of life, one spent largely in the planning and execution of large-scale enterprises conducted at the extreme edge of the habitable world, with everything that such a life involves in terms of logistics, finance, personnel, and the specific emotional texture of someone who finds that kind of work to be in some fundamental sense what they are for. The letters from the Quest voyage are the last of this range. They were written as the expedition moved south from the port of departure, making its way through the waters that Shackleton knew well, toward the island where he would die. He could not have known writing them that they would be the last.